A strange metallic taste filled my mouth as I watched Uncle Victor flip burgers on his pristine stainless steel grill. The coastal breeze carried the scent of mesquite smoke and salt air across his manicured backyard, where fairy lights strung between palm trees cast everything in a golden glow. This should have been perfect. The annual Cruz family barbecue, 30 years running, at the same seaside house where my cousins and I had built sandcastles as children. But perfection, I'd learned, had a way of highlighting imperfections. Isabella! Victor's voice boomed across the patio as Mom, Mateo, and I approached through the side gate. His smile stretched wide, arms opening in theatrical welcome. There's our little engineer, still playing with boats, I see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Cruz. I'm 34 and a former Navy engineer turned maritime entrepreneur. This is the story of how one handshake changed everything my family thought they knew about me. I maintained my polite smile as Victor's embrace lingered a beat too long, his cologne mixing with girl smoke. Playing with boats. 8 years of naval service, 2 engineering degrees, and a sustainable shipping technology company reduced to child's play. But I'd learned long ago that correcting Victor only gave him more ammunition. Victor, Mom's voice carried that careful neutrality she'd perfected since Dad died. Elena Cruz had raised 3 children alone while running her own accounting practice, but family gatherings still made her cautious. The yard looks beautiful. Patricia's been planning for weeks, Victor beamed, gesturing toward his wife, who fluttered between guests with the manic energy of someone determined to orchestrate perfection. Only the best for our family traditions. Mateo squeezed my shoulder as we surveyed the scene. 20-some relatives and neighbors scattered across the deck and lawn, cold drinks in hand, conversations flowing in Spanish and English. Kids splashed in the pool while adults clustered around appetizer tables loaded with Patricia's famous empanadas and Victor's specialty, imported Spanish chorizo he'd mentioned at least 6 times tonight. Remember, Mateo whispered, I've got papers to grade if things get unbearable. Teacher perks. But my little brother's escape route reminded me why I'd come. These people were my family, flawed as they were, and somewhere beneath Victor's condescension and Daniel's entitlement lay the memory of Sunday dinners where my grandfather spoke of legacy and honor, where my father taught me that respect was earned through actions, not inherited through gender. Isabella, mija! Cousin Sophia waved from the appetizer table, her toddler balanced on her hip. How's the single life treating you? Any prospects on the horizon? The question landed like a small knife between my ribs. At 34, my marital status had become the family's favorite conversation starter. Never mind that I spent the past year developing partnerships with 3 major shipping companies. Never mind that my team had just completed preliminary designs for hybrid propulsion systems that could revolutionize naval logistics. Still focused on work, I replied, accepting Sophia's kiss on the cheek. You know how it is. Such dedication, Victor interjected, appearing beside us with a beer in hand. Though I worry you're missing out on what really matters. Family, legacy, building something that lasts. His gaze drifted meaningfully toward Daniel, who stood near the grill regaling a group of cousins with animated gestures. Daniel Cruz, 29 years old, Victor's pride and joy, and living proof that confidence could substitute for competence if you wore the right clothes. Tonight, he sported a polo shirt with the Cruz Logistics logo, the small freight company Victor had built from a single delivery truck into a modestly successful regional operation. Dad's been talking about expanding to international shipping, Daniel announced, his voice carrying across the patio. I've been researching new markets, developing strategic partnerships. The Cruz name is about to go global. Victor's chest swelled with pride as guests murmured appreciation. I knew Daniel's research consisted mainly of Googling competitors during his lunch breaks, but pointing that out would only confirm my reputation as the difficult niece who couldn't celebrate family success. International shipping, Mrs. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Very ambitious. It's all about vision, Daniel continued, warming to his audience, seeing opportunities others miss. Dad taught me that business is about relationships, about understanding what people really need. I sipped my mojito and watched my cousin command the crowd. In another life, his confidence might have been admirable. Here, it felt like watching someone claim credit for sunrise while standing in artificial light. Isabella works with ships too, Mom offered quietly, her attempt at inclusion barely audible above Daniel's expanding monologue. Different kinds of ships, though, Victor chuckled. Navy work is all about following orders, right, Isabella? The private sector requires real entrepreneurship, vision, risk-taking.
The metallic taste intensified. I'd taken plenty of risks, leaving active duty to start my own company, developing untested technology, betting my savings on sustainable shipping solutions that established firms called too progressive. But explaining that would require revealing details I wasn't ready to share. Not yet. Something like that, I murmured, and Victor's smile suggested he'd won another small victory. Mateo moved closer, his teacher's instincts recognizing a student being bullied, but I shook my head slightly. I'd survived worse than Uncle Victor's casual dismissal. The question wasn't whether I could endure it, but whether I should. The evening settled into its familiar rhythm like a dance everyone knew by heart. Patricia's empanadas disappeared from silver platters, while guests migrated between the pool deck and dining area, conversations weaving Spanish and English in the comfortable bilingual flow that marked our gatherings. Children's laughter mixed with adult voices discussing everything from local politics to recipes passed down through 3 generations. I found myself in the kitchen refilling ice buckets and arranging fresh napkins, the invisible work that kept gatherings flowing smoothly. Through the window, I watched Victor hold court near the grill, Daniel at his right hand like a prince in training. The logistics industry is evolving rapidly. Companies that don't adapt get left behind. That's why I've been grooming Daniel for leadership. Fresh perspective, business school education, understanding of modern markets. Business school education. Daniel barely graduated from a mid-tier program, spending more time on fraternity parties than case studies. Meanwhile, I'd earned my engineering degrees while serving active duty, studying by portable lamp in ship compartments between shifts. But Victor's version of success required a different kind of credential, male lineage, and the ability to wear a suit confidently. Smart strategy, agreed Mr. Delgado, our next-door neighbor for 15 years. Family businesses need succession planning. Exactly. Victor's tone carried that satisfaction of a man whose worldview was being validated. Isabella's military experience is admirable, don't get me wrong, but it's different when you're building something from nothing, taking real financial risks, making decisions that affect people's livelihoods. I set down the ice bucket harder than necessary. Military experience was admirable, like a participation trophy for showing up to play a game that didn't really matter. Never mind that my game had involved designing propulsion systems for vessels carrying billions of dollars of equipment and hundreds of lives. Never mind that every decision I had made had affected people's livelihoods and their ability to return home safely. Isabella's always been the responsible one, added Aunt Carmen, Uncle Victor's sister. Steady job, good benefits. Smart choice for someone who wants security. Security. The word carried subtle condescension, implying I chose the safe path, while Daniel embraced the entrepreneurial unknown. They didn't know about the nights I'd spent developing business plans in my tiny apartment off base, or the veterans loan I'd leveraged to start Cruz Maritime Solutions. They didn't know about the prototype engines currently being tested at 3 different naval facilities, or the sustainable shipping consortium I'd spent 2 years building. They saw what they wanted to see. Isabella, the reliable one, content with steady paychecks and modest ambitions. Military discipline definitely has its place, Victor continued, warming to his theme, but civilian business requires different skills: creativity, flexibility, the ability to think outside established protocols. Through the window, I watched Daniel nod sagely as if these insights were profound rather than recycled business cliches. His audience murmured agreement while I arranged fruit on a platter, my hands steady despite the familiar burn in my chest. Daniel's been developing some innovative approaches to our expansion, Victor went on. Show them that presentation you put together, son. Daniel pulled out his phone, swiping to a slideshow that I recognized as a template from his business school coursework. Basic market analysis, generic competitive positioning, buzzwords strung together like decorative lights. Impressive from a distance, but revealing their hollowness upon closer inspection. We're targeting emerging markets in Central and South America, leveraging existing relationships while building new strategic partnerships. Existing relationships meant the 3 companies Victor had been working with for a decade. Strategic partnerships meant hoping they'd recommend Cruz logistics to their contacts. It wasn't wrong, exactly, but it wasn't the revolutionary vision Victor made it sound like. "Impressive research," Mrs. Rodriguez commented. "You've clearly inherited your father's business instincts." Inherited. The word stung because it was accurate. Daniel had inherited opportunity, connections, and the assumption that his ideas mattered. He'd inherited the luxury of confidence without competence, of being heard without having to prove himself first. I'd inherited different things: the expectation of service over leadership, support over innovation, invisible contribution over visible recognition. I'd inherited the burden of proving myself repeatedly while watching lesser accomplishments receive greater praise.
Isabella, could you help with the dessert table? Patricia's voice interrupted my brooding. She stood in the kitchen doorway, smiling bright, but eyes carrying that familiar mixture of affection and concern. Patricia genuinely cared about me, but her caring came wrapped in the assumption that my proper role was supportive, rather than starring. Of course. I dried my hands and followed her to the dining room, where she'd arranged an elaborate spread of flan, tres leches cake, and Mexican wedding cookies. "You're so good at these details," Patricia said, adjusting napkins that were already perfectly placed. "Some women are born homemakers. Others are born for other things. Other things. Like careers that mattered, innovations that changed industries, legacies built rather than inherited." Patricia meant it kindly, but her words carried the weight of generations of women who'd been taught to find fulfillment in supporting roles. Outside, Victor's voice rose with animated storytelling. "Daniel's been researching autonomous shipping technologies. Wave of the future, he tells me. My boy's always thinking ahead." Autonomous shipping technologies. My specialty for the past 18 months, the field where my company held 2 provisional patents and 3 active research contracts. Daniel had probably read a single article about self-navigating cargo ships and suddenly become an expert in Victor's eyes. I arranged cookies on a crystal platter, each placement precise as a naval formation. Through the dining room window, I could see the guests clustering around Daniel as he explained concepts I'd been developing since before he knew the term logistics meant more than shipping schedules. The metallic taste returned, stronger now. Not anger exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, that this pattern would continue indefinitely unless something shifted dramatically. Victor would champion Daniel's recycled ideas while dismissing my actual innovations. Family gatherings would remain exercises in diminishment disguised as celebration. But recognition also carried possibility, because somewhere in the back of my mind a plan was forming. Not tonight. Tonight I'd play my assigned role, arrange desserts and clear plates, and smile politely while my accomplishments remained invisible. But soon, very soon. The evening light had softened to that golden hour photographers love, casting everything in warm amber as guests lingered over coffee and dessert. Conversations had settled into the comfortable rhythm of family gatherings that had found their groove. Politics avoided, gossip shared in measured doses, children's achievements celebrated with appropriate enthusiasm. I moved between tables collecting empty plates and glasses, the familiar choreography of cleanup beginning while others relaxed into post-dinner contentment. This was always my role at family functions, the responsible one who noticed when serving dishes needed refilling, who quietly ensured everyone else's comfort while avoiding the spotlight. "Leave those, Isabella," Mom called softly from her seat beside Aunt Carmen. "Patricia hired caterers for cleanup."
but Patricia's caterers had vanished an hour ago and someone needed to handle the accumulating debris. Besides, staying busy meant avoiding the post-dinner conversation circles where Daniel would inevitably steer discussions toward his professional accomplishments, while I smiled and nodded from the sidelines. I carried a stack of plates toward the kitchen, navigating between guests with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years maneuvering through ship corridors during rough seas. Muscle memory from military service translated surprisingly well to family gatherings. Both required reading situations quickly, adapting to changing dynamics, and accomplishing objectives while avoiding unnecessary conflict. Isabella's got the right idea. Victor's voice boomed across the patio as I emerged from the kitchen with a dish towel. He stood near the grill, beer in hand, addressing a cluster of neighbors and relatives who'd gathered around the remnants of his grilling station. Always willing a pitch in where she's needed. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten, the same false joviality he'd used when introducing Daniel's presentation, but sharper now, more pointed. I continued wiping down the outdoor dining table, hyper-aware that conversations had quieted slightly, not enough to seem obvious, but sufficient to indicate that others had caught Victor's shift in tone. "That's Isabella for you," he continued, gesturing toward me with his beer bottle. "Finally found her true calling." The metallic taste flooded my mouth as I looked up to find Victor grinning at his audience, that particularly smug expression he wore when preparing to deliver what he considered wit. "Washing dishes." The words landed like a physical blow. Not just the casual cruelty, but the timing. Delivered in front of neighbors who'd known me since childhood, relatives who still thought of me as the quiet niece who disappeared into military service and emerged unchanged. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious exactly, but it carried that uncomfortable quality of people unsure whether they should be amused or horrified.
Daniel's laugh rang loudest, sharp with vindication. "Finally, something she's actually good at," he added, emboldened by his father's public dismissal. Heat flooded my cheeks as I forced my hands to remain steady on the table surface. 8 years of naval discipline held me upright when every instinct screamed to defend myself, to list my accomplishments, to shatter Victor's comfortable assumptions with the force of documented success. But that would require explanations I wasn't ready to give, revelations that would shift family dynamics in ways I couldn't control. So I maintained the pose Victor expected, humble, accepting, grateful for the opportunity to serve. "Someone has to do it," I managed, my voice level despite the storm raging beneath. "Exactly." Victor's triumph was palpable. "Honest work. Nothing wrong with knowing your place and doing it well." Knowing your place. The phrase carried generations of casual oppression disguised as wisdom. Women should know their place. Younger family members should know their place. Military veterans should know their place in civilian hierarchies. Anyone who threatened established order should know their place and accept it gracefully. Mom's face had gone pale, her hands gripping her coffee cup like a lifeline. Mateo stood frozen near the pool, his usual easy humor replaced by something harder. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable, her hostess instincts recognizing that Victor's joke had crossed from playful teasing into genuine cruelty. But the damage was done. Guests shifted awkwardly, some finding sudden interest in their dessert plates, others glancing between me and Victor with the fascinated horror of witnesses to a family accident. "Isabella's always been practical," Aunt Carmen offered weakly, her attempt at diplomacy falling flat in the charged atmosphere. Practical. Victor seized on the word like a drowning man grabbing a rope. That's the perfect description. Not everyone can be a visionary like Daniel here. Some people are built for support roles. Nothing wrong with that. Support roles. As if my military service had been clerical work instead of engineering complex systems that kept entire fleets operational. As if my current work involved filing papers instead of designing technology that could revolutionize maritime transportation.
I continued wiping the table with methodical precision, each stroke controlled and purposeful. Military training had taught me that sometimes the strongest response was no response, that dignity could be maintained through composure, even when others abandoned theirs. Of course, Isabella's had some interesting experiences, Mom said quietly, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when approaching dangerous subjects. The Navy was quite an adventure. Adventure, Victor waved dismissively, playing with government equipment on someone else's budget. Different things entirely from building a business from scratch, making payroll, taking real risks. The conversation continued around me as I finished cleaning, each word another small cut. Daniel expanded on his father's theme, describing the challenges of real business while I remained bent over tables, invisible in my assigned role. Guests nodded and murmured agreement, their comfortable assumptions undisturbed by inconvenient truths. The coastal breeze carried the scent of jasmine and salt air across the patio, mixing with lingering barbecue smoke and the faint sound of waves against rocks below. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like standing in the eye of a storm, surrounded by temporary calm that masked devastating winds. I folded the dish towel with military precision and headed toward the kitchen one more time, carrying the last stack of glasses. Behind me, Victor's voice continued its steady commentary on my limitations, punctuated by Daniel's eager agreement and the uncomfortable laughter of people who recognized cruelty but lacked the courage to challenge it. My hands remained steady as I set the glasses in the sink. My breathing stayed controlled as I rinsed my hands and dried them carefully. My expression maintained its polite neutrality as I prepared to return to the patio and endure whatever additional humiliation Victor had planned. But something had shifted in those moments of enforced silence. Some internal mechanism had clicked into place, like the sound of ammunition being loaded into a weapon. I wasn't ready to fire yet, but I was definitely ready to aim. Because sometimes the best response to public humiliation isn't immediate retaliation. Sometimes it's patient preparation for the moment when truth becomes more powerful than perception, when reality overwhelms carefully constructed fantasy. And I could hear a car pulling up in Victor's driveway, an engine I recognized, carrying someone who might finally force this family to see past their comfortable assumptions about Isabella Cruz and her dishwashing expertise. The sound of car doors slamming in Victor's driveway cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. Conversations paused as heads turned toward the side gate, that instinctive response to unexpected arrivals that marks the difference between planned and spontaneous moments at family gatherings. I recognized the engine's distinctive rumble before I saw the vehicle, a pristine black sedan with government plates that spoke of authority and purpose. My pulse quickened as I set down
The dish towel, muscle memory from 8 years of military service responding to the subtle cues of rank and protocol that civilians often missed. Who could that be? Patricia wondered aloud, smoothing her dress with the reflexive gesture of a hostess suddenly concerned about appearances. Victor straightened beside the grill, his chest puffing slightly as he assumed the role of gracious host receiving unexpected guests. Probably the Hendersons from down the street. They mentioned they might stop by. But the figure that emerged through the side gate wasn't Mr. Henderson with his weekend casual wear and friendly wave. This was Admiral James Jameson, United States Navy retired, but still carrying himself with the bearing that commanded attention in any room, or in this case, any backyard gathering. Even in civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt that somehow looked more formal than Daniel's designer outfit, the Admiral possessed that indefinable quality that marked career military officers. The way he surveyed the gathering before approaching, assessing dynamics and hierarchies with practiced efficiency. The slight pause before his weathered face broke into a genuine smile of recognition. "Victor Cruz," he called out, crossing the patio with measured strides. "Hope I'm not intruding on family time." The transformation in the gathering was immediate and electric. Conversations died as guests turned their full attention toward the newcomer, recognizing instinctively that someone important had entered their orbit. Children in the pool swam closer to the deck, sensing the adult excitement without understanding its source. Admiral Jameson! Victor's voice carried a note I'd never heard before, genuine deference mixed with barely contained excitement. What an honor! Please, join us. Can I get you something to drink? The Admiral had been Victor's neighbor for nearly a decade, but their interactions remained limited to polite waves across property lines and occasional discussions about neighborhood issues. Tonight represented something different. Social validation on a scale that would fuel Victor's storytelling for months. Just water, thanks, Admiral Jameson replied, accepting Victor's enthusiastic handshake. Beautiful evening for a gathering. Nothing like family time to remind us what really matters. I remained near the kitchen door, observing the scene with the detached interest of someone watching theater from the wings. Patricia fluttered around offering appetizers, while Daniel positioned himself strategically within the Admiral's line of sight, clearly hoping to be introduced as the family's rising business star. Admiral, meet my son Daniel. Victor's voice swelled with paternal pride. He's been expanding our logistics company, developing international partnerships, real entrepreneurial vision. Daniel stepped forward with practiced confidence, extending his hand. Honored to meet you, sir. I've heard so much about your distinguished service. Likewise, Admiral replied politely, but his attention was already shifting, scanning the gathering with those alert eyes that missed nothing. Military training never really faded. The habit of reading rooms, assessing personnel, understanding dynamics beneath surface pleasantries. His gaze found me standing quietly near the kitchen entrance, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprising exactly, but recognition coupled with what looked like a pleased discovery. Isabella, he said, his voice carrying across the patio with unmistakable warmth. Just the engineer I was hoping to see. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as every head swiveled toward me with confusion and curiosity. Victor's expression faltered as he tried to process why the Admiral knew his dishwashing niece by name, and more importantly, why he'd sought her out specifically. I felt the metallic taste dissolve on my tongue, replaced by something cleaner, something that tasted remarkably like vindication. Admiral Jameson, I replied, stepping forward with the composure that 8 years of military protocol had drilled into my bones. I didn't expect to see you here. Couldn't pass up the opportunity, especially after the progress reports I received this week. Outstanding work, as always. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the gentle splash of pool water against tile and the distant sounds of waves on rocks below. 30 family members and neighbors stood frozen in tableau, trying to reconcile the image of Isabella, the dishwasher, with Isabella, the engineer worthy of an admiral's personal attention. Victor's face cycled through expressions like a slideshow of confusion, bewilderment, suspicion, and something that might have been dawning comprehension. Daniel looked like a man who had just discovered his assumptions about gravity might be fundamentally flawed. Progress reports? Mom's voice carried barely concealed pride mixed with curiosity. Even she didn't know the full scope of my current projects, respecting my tendency toward privacy about work matters.
Admiral Jameson's smile broadened as he recognized the undercurrent swirling through the gathering. Military officers developed keen instincts for family dynamics, understanding how hierarchies functioned both officially and unofficially. He'd clearly assessed this situation and decided intervention was warranted. Isabella's been modest about her contributions to our joint development program, he said, his voice carrying the natural authority that made people listen without question. Revolutionary work in sustainable maritime propulsion systems, the kind of innovation that changes entire industries. Revolutionary work. Sustainable maritime propulsion systems. The phrases hung in the evening air like smoke from Victor's grill, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to dismiss. Mateo's grin was spreading across his face like sunrise,
finally understanding why his sister had endured Victor's condescension with such patient composure. Mom's eyes were bright with tears of pride and vindication. Even Patricia looked stunned, her carefully orchestrated evening suddenly shifting in directions she couldn't control. But it was Victor's expression that held my attention. The slow, dawning realization that his comfortable assumptions about family hierarchy were about to be challenged by someone whose authority he couldn't question or dismiss. The Admiral Jameson closed the distance between us with the measured precision of a man accustomed to making moments count. The evening light caught the silver at his temples and the weathered lines around eyes that had seen decades of service, commanded respect across oceans, and learned to recognize excellence regardless of where it appeared. He extended his hand toward me, and in that gesture lay something more significant than casual greeting. This was the handshake of recognition, formal acknowledgement between professionals who understood the weight of shared accomplishment. "Isabella Cruz?" he said, his voice carrying across the silent patio with unmistakable authority. "The mind behind the project that will transform our fleet operations for the next generation." I accepted his handshake, feeling the firm grip of someone who understood that gestures mattered, that public recognition carried power beyond private praise. 8 years of military service had taught me to read the subtle communications embedded in protocol, and this handshake spoke volumes about respect earned and freely given. "Thank you, Admiral," I replied, allowing my own professional bearing to surface after hours of suppressed competence. "The collaboration has been extraordinary. Working with forward-thinking leadership makes innovation possible." The silence stretching across Victor's patio had weight and texture, thick with shock and recalibration. 30 family members and neighbors stood frozen like figures in a photograph, trying to process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about quiet Isabella and her modest ambitions. Victor's face had progressed through confusion into something approaching panic. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, struggling to form words that might restore his comfortable worldview. Daniel stood beside him, an expensive polo shirt suddenly looking cheap under scrutiny that revealed substance over style. "Transform fleet operations?" Mrs. Rodriguez repeated slowly, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone testing unfamiliar concepts. "Isabella, what exactly do you do?" The question hung in the air like an invitation I'd been waiting years to accept. For the first time in memory, I had an audience genuinely interested in hearing about my work rather than dismissing it as an irrelevant hobby pursuit. "I design sustainable propulsion systems for maritime vessels, hybrid engines that reduce fuel consumption by 40% while increasing operational range. The technology applications extend from naval operations to commercial shipping." 40%, Admiral Jameson confirmed, his professional satisfaction evident. "Conservative estimate, actually. Some test configurations have exceeded 50% efficiency gains." The numbers landed like depth chargers, exploding assumptions and sending ripples of recalculation through the gathering. Even people who didn't understand maritime engineering could grasp the magnitude of those improvements, the economic implications, the environmental benefits, the competitive advantages. "Isabella's company holds 2 provisional patents," the Admiral continued, clearly enjoying his role as truth-teller in this family drama. "Cruz Maritime Solutions has secured 3 major development contracts, including our joint program with the Department of Defense." Cruz Maritime Solutions. My company's name was spoken aloud at a family gathering for the first time, carrying weight and credibility through Admiral Jameson's endorsement.
Words register on faces around the patio, recognition dawning that the quiet niece had been building something substantial while they focused on surface accomplishments. "Patents!" Daniel's voice cracked slightly on the word. "You have patents?" "Provisional approval on 2 propulsion designs, with 3 additional applications under review," I confirmed, allowing technical precision to replace the self-deprecation I'd worn like armor for years. The innovation cycle moves quickly in sustainable technology. First mover advantage matters. Mateo's laugh carried pure delight as he watched his sister emerge from the shadows into the spotlight. Isabella, you magnificent sneak! All those times you said you were just working on projects? Classified projects, Admiral Jameson clarified with a slight smile. Security protocols limit discussion of defense-related innovations until certain milestones are reached. Isabella's discretion has been exemplary. Classified projects, defense-related innovations, exemplary discretion. Each phrase added layers to the picture being painted for Victor's guests. Isabella not as humble dishwasher, but as a trusted professional handling sensitive government contracts with the competence that earned Admiral Jameson's personal endorsement. Patricia's hand fluttered to her throat, her hostess instincts struggling to process this fundamental shift in evening dynamics. Isabella, why didn't you tell us? We had no idea you were working on such important things. Class gatherings seemed more appropriate for celebrating Daniel's accomplishments, I replied, allowing the slightest edge to enter my voice. Business school education, strategic partnerships, international expansion plans, very impressive achievements. The gentle rebuke landed exactly where intended. Victor's face flushed as he realized his father's boasting session had been built on quicksand, while the real foundation stood unrecognized in the background. Victor's grip tightened on his beer bottle, knuckles white with the strain of holding on to assumptions that were crumbling in real time. Strategic partnerships. Admiral Jameson's tone carried the professional assessment of someone who understood the difference between aspirational planning and executed results. Isabella managed to build collaborative relationships with 12 maritime companies across 4 countries. Impressive network for someone so young. 12 companies, 4 countries. The scoop of my professional relationships mapped out in numbers that dwarfed Daniel's local ambitions and Victor's regional success. I watched comprehension dawn on faces throughout the gathering, understanding that they'd been witnessing the emergence of something far more significant than family one-upmanship. Mom's tears were flowing freely now, pride and vindication mixing with years of watching her daughter endure dismissal while quietly building an empire. Isabella, mija, your father would be so proud. He always said recognition would come when the work was ready to speak for itself, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm careful composure. Some things can't be rushed. Admiral Jameson nodded approvingly, recognizing wisdom earned through experience rather than inherited through assumption. Patience and preparation create sustainable success. Isabella embodies both qualities. The endorsement hung in the evening air like smoke from Victor's neglected grill, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to dismiss. For the first time in family memory, Isabella Cruz stood at the center of attention, not as a dutiful helper, but as an accomplished professional, receiving recognition from someone whose opinion carried weight beyond challenge. And Victor, architect of the evening's humiliation, faced the devastating realization that he'd been fundamentally wrong about the most important person in the room. The transformation rippling through Victor's patio reminded me of watching sonar readings during naval exercises, invisible energy waves spreading outward from a central point, revealing hidden depths and structures that surface observation had missed entirely. Conversations erupted in clusters as guests processed information that reframed everything they thought they knew about family dynamics and professional accomplishment. Sustainable shipping technology, Mr. Delgado mused, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone recalibrating assumptions in real time. Isabella, I had no idea. My brother works for Maersk. He's mentioned companies developing cleaner engines. Could that be your work? The question opened floodgates of curiosity that had been sealed by years of casual dismissal. Suddenly, everyone wanted details about patents and partnerships, about naval contracts and international collaborations. The same people who had nodded politely through Daniel's recycled business school presentations now hung on my explanations of hybrid propulsion systems and sustainable fuel alternatives. Maersk is part of our consortium, I confirmed, allowing professional pride to surface after hours of enforced modesty.
along with several Nordic companies pioneering green shipping initiatives. The European market is particularly receptive to environmental innovation. European market, Sophia repeated, bouncing her toddler absently as she processed the implications. Isabella, are you saying you work internationally? Like actually working with companies in other countries?
12 companies across 4 countries, Admiral Jameson interjected smoothly, clearly enjoying his role as Isabella's professional advocate. Her designs are being tested simultaneously in Norway, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. Quite an achievement for a woman barely into her 30s. The numbers cascaded through the gathering like depth charges, each one exploding another assumption about quiet Isabella's limited ambitions. 12 companies, 4 countries, simultaneous testing. The scope of my professional network suddenly dwarfed every other business venture represented at this gathering. Victor stood frozen near his abandoned grill, beer forgotten in his hand, watching his comfortable worldview crumble like sandcastles at high tide. The nephew-in-law who'd spent the evening dismissing his dishwashing niece now faced the reality that she commanded more professional respect than anyone in his extended family had ever achieved. "How long have you been building this company?" Aunt Carmen asked, her voice mixing admiration with something that might have been guilt. "We've been missing so much." 4 years of active development, I replied, choosing precision over emotion. Though the foundational research began during my final years of naval service, military experience provided excellent preparation for managing complex technical projects. Military experience. The phrase carried new weight in this context, transforming from Victor's casual dismissal of following orders into recognition of leadership training that enabled international business development. I watched faces around the patio reassess their understanding of naval service and its civilian applications. Daniel attempted to insert himself into the conversation with desperate optimism. "That's incredible, Isabella. Actually, Dad and I have been discussing expansion into sustainable logistics. Maybe we could explore some synergies between our companies." The naked opportunism in his voice made several guests look away uncomfortably. After an evening of casual dismissal, Daniel's sudden interest in collaboration felt particularly tone-deaf. But his attempt at professional pivot revealed something deeper. Recognition that the family's business hierarchy had fundamentally shifted. "Sustainable logistics is certainly growing," I replied diplomatically, offering neither encouragement nor dismissal. "The market rewards genuine innovation over theoretical interest." Admiral Jameson's slight smile suggested he appreciated the subtle distinction between proven accomplishment and aspirational positioning. Innovation requires sustained commitment. Isabella's been developing these technologies for years, while others were still debating market viability. The contrast was stark and unavoidable. Daniel's sudden enthusiasm for sustainability looked opportunistic beside my years of dedicated development. Victor's boasting about future international expansion paled next to my existing partnerships across 4 countries. The evening's earlier narrative had inverted completely. "Isabella, I feel terrible," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice heavy with regret. "All these years, we thought you were we didn't realize." "You thought I was just getting by," I finished gently, recognizing her struggle with diplomatic language. "It's understandable. I've been deliberately quiet about work matters." "Deliberately quiet?" Mateo echoed with growing glee. "My sister, the secret maritime mogul. Do you have any idea how many papers I'm going to grade while thinking about this?" His teacher's delight in dramatic irony lightened the atmosphere slightly, but the fundamental tension remained. Victor's entire worldview, his assumptions about success, about family hierarchy, about gender and achievement, had been revealed as fundamentally flawed by someone whose authority he couldn't challenge. "The discretion was necessary," Admiral Jameson explained, his military bearing adding gravity to the moment. "Defense contracts require security clearance protocols. Isabella couldn't discuss certain aspects of her work even if she had wanted to." Security clearance protocols.
The phrase landed like a final depth charge, explaining years of Isabella's mysterious absences and vague responses about work projects. She hadn't been evasive about minor accomplishments. She'd been professionally required to maintain confidentiality about major ones. Patricia approached hesitantly, her hostess instincts finally overcoming shock. Isabella, would you like something stronger than water? Wine? This calls for celebration. The offer represented more than beverage service. It marked Patricia's recognition that the evening's honored guest had shifted from Daniel to Isabella, that celebration now centered on genuine achievement rather than aspirational boasting. Wine would be lovely, I accepted, noting how the simple request commanded immediate attention from multiple relatives eager to serve the newly recognized family success story. Victor remained motionless near his grill, the evening's architect of humiliation, now facing the devastating realization that he'd chosen the wrong target. His attempt to diminish Isabella had instead illuminated her accomplishments while exposing his own limitations of vision and judgment. The metallic taste had completely disappeared from my mouth, replaced with something clean and bright. Victory, perhaps, but tempered with years of patience finally rewarded. The family gathering continued around me, but the dynamics had shifted permanently.
I was no longer the dishwashing niece tolerating condescension. I was Isabella Cruz, maritime engineer, defense contractor, and international business developer, finally receiving the recognition that competence and persistence had earned. And the evening wasn't over yet. The silence stretched across the patio like a held breath, weighted with the tension that precedes either explosion or collapse. Victor stood motionless beside his abandoned grill, the evening's master of ceremonies reduced to spectator at his own gathering, while his carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. I watched him struggle with the mathematics of humiliation, how to reconcile his public dismissal of Isabella the dishwasher with the emerging reality of Isabella the defense contractor. His face cycled through expressions like a man sorting through lies that no longer fit the situation. "Well," Victor finally managed, his voice carrying forced joviality that fooled nobody, "this is certainly unexpected news." The word unexpected landed with particular irony. Nothing about my accomplishments should have been unexpected to family members who'd paid attention instead of assuming. But Victor's worldview had required my limitations to validate his son's superiority, creating blind spots that Admiral Jameson had just illuminated with surgical precision. "Isabella's always been modest about her achievements," Mom offered quietly, her diplomatic instincts attempting to smooth over the growing tension. "She's never been one for boasting." "Modest," Siartov seized the word, like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. "Yes, that's Isabella. Very modest. Sometimes too modest, perhaps. Makes it difficult to know what's really happening." But his attempt at damage control only highlighted the evening's earlier cruelty. If I'd been too modest about genuine accomplishments, what did that say about his public ridicule of my dishwashing duties? The logic trapped him between acknowledging his ignorance or defending his assumptions. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside his father, finally recognizing that his smugness had been built on quicksand. "I mean, it's great news. Really impressive work, Isabella. Though I have to wonder about the timing of sharing this information." The implied accusation hung in the air that I deliberately withheld news of my success to make tonight's revelation more dramatic. It was a desperate attempt to shift responsibility, to suggest I'd orchestrated this confrontation rather than simply endured their dismissal until external validation arrived. Admiral Jandison's expression sharpened with military precision. "Timing?" His voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to cutting through diplomatic evasion. "Mr. Cruz, your cousin has been developing classified defense technologies. The timing for public disclosure isn't her decision. It's determined by security protocols and contract milestones." The rebuke was surgical in its precision. Daniel's implication that I'd been manipulative collapsed under the weight of national security requirements, leaving him looking petulant rather than perceptive.
But Victor, recognizing his son's misstep, attempted a different approach. Of course, Victor said quickly, his tone growing more desperate. I'm sure Isabella's work is significant, though sometimes these military projects can seem more important than they really are. Government contracts, lots of paperwork, lots of bureaucracy, not quite the same as real private sector success. The dismissal was breathtaking in its audacity. Faced with evidence of my international partnerships and innovative technology, Victor attempted to minimize military contracts as somehow less legitimate than his regional logistics company. His desperation was making him reckless. Admiral Jameson's silence stretched like the pause before thunder. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that made career officers legendary. Mr. Cruz, I have spent 32 years evaluating military contractors and private sector partnerships. Isabella's work represents the kind of innovation that transforms entire industries. The professional assessment landed with devastating finality. Victor's attempt to diminish military contracts had instead provoked testimony from someone whose expertise was unassailable, whose judgment carried weight far beyond family politics. Private sector success, the Admiral continued, his tone gaining edge, is ultimately measured by results. Isabella's hybrid propulsion systems are being implemented by companies that represent 40% of global shipping tonnage. Her innovations will reduce maritime fuel consumption by billions of gallons annually. Billions of gallons. The number rolled across the patio like artillery fire, obliterating any remaining pretense that Victor's local trucking operation could compete with Isabella's global impact. Guests shifted uncomfortably as the scope of professional achievement became impossible to ignore or minimize. That's quite impressive, Victor managed, his voice cracking slightly. Though, of course, the real test of business success is sustainability. Building something that lasts, creating a legacy for the next generation. Legacy for the next generation. The phrase carried bitter irony given Victor's earlier celebration of Daniel's mediocre accomplishments while dismissing Isabella's revolutionary work. He was retreating toward his final defensive position, the assumption that family business succession trumped individual innovation.
Sustainability, I repeated, finally choosing to engage directly rather than allowing others to defend my accomplishments. You're absolutely right, Uncle Victor. That's exactly what my work addresses. Sustainable maritime transportation for the next 50 years. The wordplay was gentle, but unmistakable. Victor's appeal to business sustainability had walked directly into my specialty in environmental sustainability, revealing once again his fundamental misunderstanding of both my work and current market forces. Isabella's patents have 20-year protection periods, Admiral Jameson added with evident satisfaction. Her technology platform provides the foundation for decades of innovation. That's what I call building something that lasts. 20-year patents, decades of innovation, foundation for sustained development. Each phrase demolished another pillar of Victor's comfortable assumptions while establishing Isabella's work as the kind of legacy he claimed to value most. Daniel made one final, desperate attempt at relevance. Well, patents are theoretical until they're actually implemented at scale. It's one thing to design something, another thing entirely to build a business around it. The comment revealed his complete misunderstanding of everything that had been discussed. Admiral Jameson's earlier testimony had explicitly described implementation across multiple countries and companies, but Daniel's desperation had made him deaf to inconvenient facts. Implementation at scale, I replied calmly, is exactly what we've achieved. Current installations across 67 vessels, with another 200 scheduled for retrofit over the next 18 months. 67 vessels, 200 scheduled retrofits. The numbers fell like hammer blows against Daniel's theoretical objections, demonstrating implementation far beyond his family business experience. Victor's beer bottle slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against patio stones with a crystalline crash that punctuated his worldview's complete collapse.
The sound drew every eye to the man who'd spent the evening celebrating his son's modest achievements while publicly humiliating his accomplished niece. The moment crystallized around that broken glass, sharp-edged fragments of assumptions that could never be reassembled into their original comfortable form. Victor Cruz, master of family hierarchy, faced the devastating realization that he'd chosen entirely the wrong target for dismissal. And the evening still held more revelations to come. The sound of Victor's beer bottle shattering seemed to break more than glass. It shattered the last barrier between the Isabella who'd spent years accepting family dismissal and the Isabella who commanded international respect in maritime engineering. The crash crystallized something fundamental, the moment when silence transforms into voice, when patience yields to presence. I stepped forward, my movement drawing every eye on the patio. For the first time all evening, I wasn't responding to someone else's narrative or deflecting someone else's assumptions. The space belonged to me now, and I intended to fill it with truth. "I'd like to share something with all of you," I began, my voice carrying the clear authority I'd learned commanding engineering teams across 3 naval deployments, since there seems to be confusion about what I actually do. The gathering fell silent with the particular attention reserved for moments when familiar dynamics shift permanently. Patricia paused in sweeping up Victor's broken glass. Daniel stopped his nervous fidgeting. Even the children in the pool seemed to sense that something important was happening. Cruz Maritime Solutions began with a simple observation. Maritime shipping accounts for nearly 3% of global carbon emissions. That's more than entire countries produce. But the industry has been slow to innovate because traditional fuel systems seemed adequate for immediate needs. The military faces different pressures. Naval vessels must operate efficiently across vast distances with minimal resupply opportunities. Fuel efficiency isn't just environmental responsibility, it's operational necessity. That created demand for innovation that civilian shipping hadn't yet recognized. Admiral Jameson nodded approvingly as I laid out the strategic foundation for my work. Military professionals understood how operational requirements drove technological advancement, how necessity mothered innovations that eventually transformed entire industries. My hybrid propulsion systems address both challenges simultaneously: reduced emissions for environmental compliance, extended range for operational flexibility. The same technology that makes naval vessels more effective also makes commercial shipping more sustainable. Sustainable shipping, Mr. Delgado repeated thoughtfully. Isabella, forgive my ignorance, but how exactly does your technology work differently from traditional engines?
The question opened the door I'd been waiting years to walk through. The opportunity to explain complex engineering in terms that non-technical family members could understand and appreciate. Traditional marine engines burn fossil fuel continuously, I replied, moving my hands to illustrate concepts as I'd learned to do during technical presentations. My systems integrate battery storage with optimized combustion engines, allowing vessels to run on electric power during low-demand periods and switch to hybrid mode for high-performance operations. I could see comprehension dawning on faces throughout the gathering. The technology wasn't mysterious or theoretical. It was practical engineering applied to real-world challenges that everyone could understand. But the real innovation is in the control systems, I continued, gaining momentum as professional enthusiasm overcame years of enforced modesty. Smart algorithms that predict power demands based on weather conditions, cargo weight, and route planning. The vessels essentially learn to optimize their own fuel consumption. Vessels that learn, Sophia mused, her toddler finally still in her arms. Like artificial intelligence for ships? Exactly like that. Machine learning applied to maritime operations. The longer a vessel operates with our systems, the more efficient it becomes. Current test fleets are showing 40 to 50% fuel reduction compared to baseline measurements. The numbers landed with appropriate impact.
Even family members who didn't understand engineering could grasp the significance of having fuel consumption across an industry that moved 90% of global trade. 50%, Mateo whistled appreciatively. Isabella, that's not just impressive, that's revolutionary. You're talking about transforming how the entire world moves goods. Revolutionary. The word hung in the evening air like validation I'd been craving for years. Not just successful, not just competent, but genuinely transformative in scope and impact. The environmental implications are staggering, I agreed, allowing passion to enter my voice for the first time. If implemented across just the top 50 shipping companies, our technology would reduce maritime emissions by amounts equivalent to removing 8 million cars from roads annually. 8 million cars! The comparison provided a scale that made abstract engineering concrete and personally meaningful. Guests exchanged glances as they processed the magnitude of environmental impact I was describing. But the environmental benefits represent only half the value proposition, I continued, fully in my element now. Fuel costs constitute 30 to 40% of shipping operating expenses. Our systems pay themselves through reduced consumption within 18 to 24 months. Mom's eyes were bright with tears as she watched her daughter finally receive the platform to showcase accomplishments that had remained hidden for years. Cruz had raised 3 children while building her own accounting practice, understanding better than anyone the challenges of professional recognition in male-dominated fields. Isabella, Patricia said softly, her voice mixing admiration with regret. Why didn't you ever tell us about this work? We had no idea you were involved in something so important. The question cut to the heart of years of family dynamics, touching on assumptions and dismissals that had made sharing impossible until external validation arrived. I tried to share, I replied gently, choosing honesty over diplomatic evasion. But conversations about my work were consistently redirected toward more traditional topics. Marriage prospects, settling down, finding stability. My achievement seemed less important than my relationship status. The uncomfortable silence that followed acknowledged years of misplaced priorities, of reducing accomplished women to their romantic circumstances rather than their professional contributions. Admiral Jameson stepped forward slightly, his military bearing added weight to the moment. Isabella's discretion also reflected security requirements, he added. Defense contractors can't discuss classified work at social gatherings. Her silence protected not just proprietary technology, but national security interests. National security interests. The phrase reframed years of mysterious work absences and vague project descriptions, revealing them as professional obligations rather than evasive personality traits. So, when you disappeared for weeks at a time, Aunt Carmen said slowly, you weren't just traveling for work, you were working on classified military projects. Testing installations on active naval vessels, I confirmed. Performance evaluation requires sea trials under operational conditions. The work couldn't be done from an office. The revelation added another layer to the evening's reassessment of Isabella's accomplishments. Not just innovative engineering, not just international partnerships, but work significant enough to require security clearance and classified operations. Victor remained silent throughout my explanation, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't fully read. Shock, certainly. Regret, possibly, but also something that might have been dawning recognition that his assumptions about success, about worth, about family hierarchy had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning.
The space I'd claimed through competence and clarity now felt permanent rather than borrowed. Isabella Cruz, maritime engineer, had finally found her voice at a family gathering. And there was still more truth to tell. The formal gathering began dissolving into smaller clusters as evening deepened, conversations fragmenting into the intimate exchanges that mark the difference between public performance and private reckoning. Patricia's fairy lights cast warm pools of illumination across the patio, while guests processed revelations that had fundamentally altered their understanding of family dynamics and professional achievement. I found myself near the pool's edge, watching reflected light dance on water while family members approached individually, some offering congratulations, others seeking forgiveness for years of misunderstanding. The evening's dramatic revelation had created space for quieter truths that required more delicate handling. Daniel was the first to approach, his earlier smugness replaced by something that might have been genuine humility. His expensive polo shirt looked rumpled now, confidence deflated by the evening's harsh lessons about substance versus appearance. "Isabella," he began hesitantly, his voice lacking its usual performative quality. "I owe you an apology. I've been such an ass." The admission carried surprising sincerity. Daniel had spent years basking in his father's favoritism while dismissing his cousin's quiet competence. But Admiral Jameson's testimony had shattered comfortable assumptions about relative worth. "You believed what you were told to believe," I replied carefully, choosing understanding over vindication. "Family narratives can be powerful things." "No," Daniel shook his head, running fingers through perfectly styled hair. "That's too generous. I knew you were smart. I knew you were capable. I liked feeling superior, you know? Being Dad's golden boy meant everything to me." The confession revealed insecurities I'd suspected but never confirmed. Daniel's arrogance had been armor against the fear that he might not deserve his father's favoritism, that his accomplishments might not withstand comparison to family members who'd actually earned their success. Feeling superior is comfortable, until reality intrudes. "Reality," Daniel laughed bitterly. "Jesus, Isabella. Patents, international partnerships, defense contracts. While I've been playing dress-up businessman, you've been building an empire." Empire was too strong a word, but I understood his meaning. The scope of my professional network did dwarf his regional ambitions in ways that made his father's boasting seem particularly hollow. "Different paths," I offered diplomatically. "Different timelines." "Don't," Daniel said sharply, then caught himself. "Sorry. Don't make excuses for me. I've wasted years on easy victories while you were doing the actual work. That's on me." The acknowledgement carried weight precisely because it came unprompted. Daniel wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was acknowledging truth regardless of whether it served his interests. For the first time in years, I glimpsed the person he might have been without his father's toxic favoritism. Before I could respond, Victor himself appeared at the pool's edge, his earlier bravado replaced by something more complex. The man who'd orchestrated the evening's humiliation now faced the devastating aftermath of his public misjudgment. "Daniel, give us a moment," Victor said quietly, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Daniel nodded and withdrew toward the house, leaving us alone beside water that reflected fairy lights like scattered stars. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Victor struggled with words that couldn't restore his comfortable worldview. "Isabella," he finally began, his voice carrying unfamiliar uncertainty. I owe you an apology," I finished when his words faltered. "Yes, a massive apology. What I said earlier about dishwashing, about knowing your place," Victor's voice broke slightly. "It was cruel, ignorant, completely wrong." The admission cost him considerable effort.
Victor Cruz had built his identity around being right about business, about success, about family hierarchy. Acknowledging his fundamental error required dismantling core assumptions about his own judgment. "You didn't know about my work," I said carefully, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology. "I didn't want to know," Victor corrected with brutal honesty. "I was so invested in Daniel's success, in proving that traditional paths were better, that I refused to see what you were accomplishing." Traditional paths. The phrase revealed the generational and gender assumptions that had driven his behavior. In Victor's worldview, women should follow traditional paths while men pursue innovation and leadership. My success challenged not just his assessment of me, but his entire framework for understanding how the world should work.
Traditional paths have their value, I replied diplomatically, though we both knew his dismissal had gone far beyond promoting alternatives. "Stop being so fucking gracious," Victor said suddenly, anger flashing in his voice. "I humiliated you in front of 30 people. I reduced 8 years of military service and 4 years of revolutionary work to dishwashing jokes. You have every right to be furious." The profanity was startling, because Victor rarely cursed at family gatherings, maintaining a carefully controlled public persona. But his composure had cracked under the weight of recognition that he'd chosen entirely the wrong target for dismissal. "Fury is exhausting," I said honestly. "I've had years to process your disappointment in me." "Disappointment?" Victor stared at me in shock. "Isabella, I wasn't disappointed. I was threatened." Threatened? The word hung between us like a confession he hadn't intended to make. "Threatened? By what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Victor was quiet for a long moment, staring at pool lights that turned water into liquid gold. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone finally abandoning a position that had become untenable. "By the possibility that you were better than Daniel, better than me, that everything I'd told myself about success and achievement and who deserved recognition might be wrong." The admission was more honest than I'd expected, revealing insecurities that explained years of systematic dismissal. Victor hadn't minimized my accomplishments because he thought they were minor. He'd minimized them because he feared they were major. "Better is complicated," I replied carefully. "Different people contribute different things." "No," Victor shook his head firmly. "Don't give me that relativistic bullshit. You've achieved more in 4 years than our entire family has accomplished in 2 generations. That's not different. That's better." Better. The word carried weight that transcended simple comparison, acknowledging hierarchies of impact and innovation that Victor had spent years pretending didn't exist. "What happens now?" I asked, genuinely curious about how family dynamics would adjust to this new reality. Victor was quiet for another moment, considering implications that extended far beyond a single evening's revelations. "Now I figure out how to be proud of you instead of being threatened by you. How to support your success instead of undermining it." Support instead of undermining. The distinction acknowledged years of active sabotage disguised as protective concern, of deliberate minimization presented as family loyalty. "That would be appreciated," I said carefully, unsure whether Victor possessed the emotional flexibility required for such fundamental change. "Isabella," Victor said, extending his hand in a gesture that echoed Admiral Jameson's earlier recognition. "Respect isn't given, it's earned. You've earned mine, even if it took me too long to admit it." I accepted his handshake, noting the difference between this private acknowledgement and the public recognition that had preceded it. Both mattered, but in different ways. Admiral Jameson had validated my professional worth. Victor's admission validated something more personal: the possibility that family relationships could evolve beyond comfortable assumptions toward genuine respect. The evening wasn't over, but something important had shifted permanently. Isabella Cruz, dishwashing niece, had finally been replaced by Isabella Cruz,
accomplished professional worthy of recognition from both strangers and family members who should have known better all along. Recovery would take time. Trust would require rebuilding. But for the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about the possibility of belonging to a family that saw me clearly, rather than through the distorting lens of their own limitations. Later that evening, as coastal fog began rolling in from the Pacific, I sat with Mom and Mateo on Victor's deck overlooking the water. The fairy lights had dimmed, guests had departed with promises to stay in better touch, and the three of us finally had space to process the evening's revelations in comfortable silence. "Your father would have been so proud," Mom said softly, her voice carrying years of quiet faith in her daughter's potential. "He always said you had the mind for building things that mattered." Building things that mattered. Dad's phrase felt prophetic now, validated by Admiral Jameson's recognition and even Victor's grudging acknowledgement. The hybrid propulsion systems weren't just engineering achievements, they were legacy in motion, innovations that would outlast family gatherings and professional rivalries. "He would have loved tonight's drama," Mateo added with his teacher's appreciation for ironic justice. Uncle Victor getting schooled by an admiral, Daniel realizing his golden boy status was built on quicksand. My sister emerged from the shadows like some maritime superhero. Maritime superhero. The description made me laugh despite the evening's emotional weight. I'm not sure superheroes spend years quietly enduring family dismissal.
"The best ones do," Mom replied firmly. "They build their strength in private before revealing it when it matters most." I looked out at the ocean, where navigation lights marked vessels moving cargo across dark waters. Somewhere out there, ships equipped with my hybrid systems were proving that innovation could serve both environmental responsibility and operational excellence. The technology I developed in naval laboratories and perfected through international partnerships was already changing how the world moved goods across oceans. "What happens next?" Mateo asked, following my gaze toward the horizon. "Next, I stop hiding what I've built," I replied, feeling the certainty that comes from finally claiming the space you've earned. No more deflecting questions about work. No more accepting dismissal for the sake of family peace. Cruz Maritime Solutions has a story worth telling. "And Uncle Victor?" I considered the question carefully, weighing years of resentment against the evening's painful but genuine apologies. Victor will have to decide whether he can genuinely support my success or just pretend to. Either way, his opinion doesn't define my worth anymore. The fog thickened around us, muffling sound and wrapping the deck in intimate privacy. For the first time in memory, a family gathering had ended with Isabella Cruz recognized rather than dismissed, celebrated rather than tolerated. "I have a confession," Mom said quietly. "I always knew you were destined for something extraordinary. I just didn't know how extraordinary until night." Destined for something extraordinary. The phrase carried weight that transcended tonight's vindication, acknowledging potential that had always existed beneath years of enforced modesty and strategic silence. "The extraordinary part isn't the technology," I replied, understanding something fundamental about the evening's significance. "It's proving that respect can be earned even when it isn't given freely." Mateo nodded thoughtfully. "My students are going to love this story. The quiet genius who let her work speak louder than her uncle's assumptions." The quiet genius. Another description that felt both accurate and incomplete. I'd been quiet by necessity, strategic rather than naturally reticent. But genius, if that's what sustainable innovation represented, had finally found its voice. "Tomorrow I'm calling my team," I announced, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. Cruz Maritime Solutions is ready to step out of classified development into the commercial spotlight. Commercial spotlight. The phrase represented more than business strategy. It meant claiming recognition that had been deferred too long for security reasons and family dynamics that had demanded invisibility. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, dark water carrying vessels that would soon run cleaner and more efficiently because of technology developed by the woman Victor had dismissed as a dishwasher. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my uncle had been celebrating his son's modest achievements, his neglected niece had been quietly revolutionizing an industry that moved the world's commerce.
Isabella, Mom said, reaching for my hand, promise me something. What? Never hide your light again. Not for family peace, not for other people's comfort, not for any reason. The world needs what you've built. The world needs what you've built? The words settled into my chest like an anchor finding a seafloor, solid and permanent. For years, I'd measured success by family acceptance, seeking validation from people who'd been incapable of recognizing excellence that didn't match their narrow expectations. Tonight had changed that equation permanently. I promise, I said, meaning it completely. No more hiding. The fog continued rolling in from the Pacific, but for the first time in years, my future felt crystal clear. Isabella Cruz, maritime engineer, defense contractor, and patent holder, was ready to claim the recognition that competence and innovation had earned. The family gathering was over, but the legacy I'd been building was just beginning to surface. In naval terminology, we'd call this moment full steam ahead, and after tonight, there would be no looking back.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.